I'm James Levy, Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Public History Program at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. And I'm the founder and director of the Lands We Share initiative, which was a traveling exhibit that ran through the state from fall 2018 through spring of 2019. And it included public dialogue along the way, community dinners and conversations that we held at each stop along the way. The focus of the tour was on the intersection of farming, land, ethnic culture, and history in Wisconsin. And the project's an initiative of a larger umbrella project called the Wisconsin Farms Oral History Project, which we founded in 2012, and involves a collaboration utilizing all the resources of the UW system. Those include, of course, faculty and students throughout the system, as well as the State Historical Society, whose branches are all affiliated with UW campuses, and even the Ag Extension Service for Farmers, which is also affiliated with UW. 4 campuses are involved in the collaboration, so it's us at Whitewater, as well as UW Oshkosh, UW Madison, and UW Milwaukee. And our broader goal, our broader mission is to link deep history, which we define as archival, sort of formal archival research, as well as local and community history, including family histories and genealogies, to bring that kind of deep research and history to connect to contemporary issues, particularly as those relate to food and farming, and then to use that work to explore both shared and contested histories about specific pieces of land and specific geographic spaces. These include histories of land dispossession and even community displacement. In order to frame, using these stories, our hope has been to frame conversations and ultimately acknowledge shared experiences, both past and present, that may help provide starting points for understanding and dialogue. In order to do this, our research focused on just 5 farms. We went deep into 5 sites, and those you can see on this map represented mostly central and eastern Wisconsin, but they included a real diversity of farms and farmers and farm workers, from white-owned farms who employ migrant labor of workers from Laos and Mexico, to deep old traditions of native farming and the Oneida Nation near Green Bay, who have a long history of agriculture, as well as who are reclaiming traditional practices such as sacred white corn growing on their reservation. It included a Hmong family who moved to a dairy farm and started growing vegetables, and employed some of the practices they had used traditionally in Laos. And it included an urban garden in Milwaukee who had basically taken repossessed land that had been condemned, houses that had been torn down, and turned it into growing. And it included a garden for youth and nutritional programs for youth. In its final form, the exhibit included artifacts, it included deeply researched narratives. It went locally to the areas where the farms we had featured were, and then of course it included oral histories. In addition to that, it was the exhibit was really framed as a way to spark conversation. So people would go to the exhibit, and then we would sponsor a farm-to-table dinner. And at the dinner, we would have people answer questions and talk to each other about locally based issues that were triggered by the framing of their historical experiences. And this is Milwaukee. Ultimately, we believe in looking at land, looking at mapping and literal properties, and the layering of space, and plat maps and things like that. We can get a sense, we can use this sort of investigation of ownership and property and possession to help us frame interracial dialogue and even dialogue across the rural and urban divide in ways that are productive and collaborative and that emphasize common ground without erasing the inequities of history that go with those land dynamics. But questions still remain about the nature of how land holds memory, and whose memory gets held, right? Who has the advantage? Whose history is preserved and how it's preserved, and how the official histories and the local and familial histories all interact in terms of the relations of power and equities across these questions that we're asking. So I really look forward to this conversation, because it really gets at some of the things that I think this panel is about. And one of those core questions is about how loaded the question of knowledge and expertise are, and how that gets defined in these community-based projects. So I have much more to say, and I look forward to talking to the panelists about that.
Hello, I am Julie Wise, Associate Professor of History at the University of Oregon. And the Nuestro South project began when I received an email from Eric Valera, a Latino community activist in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And Eric had heard me on WUNC radio talking about my book, Corazón de Dixie, Mexicanos in the U.S. South Since 1910. And basically, Eric emailed me and said that his perspective was that the black-white narrative of Southern history was actively disenfranchising Latinx youth in North Carolina, and that he thought that learning about the histories of Mexican migration to the South could transform that. And he said to me, I want to see the histories from your book on the smartphone of every Latinx young person in the South. And I was like, okay, that sounds good. Let's work on that. So a few years later, we kept in touch, and we received a Whiting Seed Grant to work together along with the nonprofit Latinx Ed in Chapel Hill to produce the Nuestro South podcast. We essentially were able to pay 3 brilliant Latino and Latina college students in North Carolina from immigrant families in North Carolina to read my book and reflect on its 5 historical community studies through the lens of their own experiences growing up Latinx in the rural and urban South. And the project editor is also a Latina college student in North Carolina. So the podcast has now been played more than 2,000 times, and I'll play a clip for you. This is one of our hosts, Axel Herrera, talking about pro-immigrant conservatism, a time in the 1960s through 90s when rural white Southern conservatives, led by farmers and evangelicals, openly embraced pro-immigrant positions. And while you listen, you can see our lovely hosts and logo.
There's one interesting story that I want to kind of to highlight to let others know, like specifically like what pro-immigrant conservative means. And I think there's something that very specific that could help you understand that. And there's this story about kind of a crew leader. His name was Avalos. He went by Slim though. That was the nickname he was given. And he led a crew of actually like Mexican and black agricultural laborers as well. And there's this very kind of interesting point based on his story where one of the farmers was like, it's so that one of the farmers gives him a message and tells him, hey, keep your crew or anyone who's undocumented away from the farm, because there's going to be either a check or a raid during that day. And then that's something very interesting, because you realize that in these situations, I feel like that's one of the most like pro-immigrant, pro-undocumented thing you can do is like, don't go through this checkpoint, like, don't come to this place. Yeah, no, exactly. So, and these people were saying, we don't think what the government doing is right. We don't think that they should be having this power to come and take people. We don't think they should be messing, with our business. And that was really it. It was their business mostly that they were protecting, but in a way they were acknowledging that, there was merit to having these immigrant workers around. They gave merit to the work that the immigrants did. And that's what kept some of this anti-immigrant stuff at bay for the South until you have kind of this like shift.
So just before COVID hit, we received funding, again from the Whiting Foundation, to film a road trip-themed YouTube series exploring the history of Mexican migration to the South. We were supposed to film in May, and that plan is now on hold, but we're moving forward with some scaled-down interim plans.
Hello, My name is Tomas Sommer Sandoval, and I'm an associate professor of history and Latinx studies at Pomona College. And the project I'm talking about today is called Ring of Red, a Barrio Story, and it's a theatrical stage play that I wrote and produced based on oral histories with Mexican-American Vietnam veterans and their families. My current work focuses on this topic, but it's always been much more than an academic project for me. I'm the son of a Vietnam veteran, whose older brother, my uncle, is also a Vietnam vet. So growing up, it seemed as though every adult male that I knew was a Vietnam veteran. And so this is a history with which I've always lived, one that I palpably knew as part of the extended living archive of Chicano Los Angeles, yet at the same time, one that's largely absent from the historical record. This is an important place for me to start because my journey into public-facing humanities owes a lot to those connections and to the commitments of Chicanx Latinx studies, ones that seek to generate new scholarship, but scholarship that has meaning for populations that are too often excluded from canonical knowledge. And that's what started my effort to collect oral histories with Latino vets and their family members. It was at heart a way to correct the gaps in the archival record, yet at the same time, I felt it started to place a burden on me to find ways to share the knowledge that I collected back with the communities from which it came. My first attempt to do that came 3 years ago with a public history exhibit called Vietnam Veteranos, Mexican America and the Legacy of Vietnam. It was a rewarding experience in a lot of ways, not the least of which was collaborating with a group of community members who helped make the whole month-long exhibit and accompanying program a success. They're pictured here. After conducting some 60 oral histories in total, I started to think of other ways that I could connect people to this history. And what I kept coming back to were the kinds of stories that were repeated over and over again in multiple people's interviews, ones that I started to think of as a kind of collective narrative.
He says, "Hey, Gomez." I go, "What? Come over to the section tonight." I said, "What more?" I said, "Just come on over." So I went over to the section. He had gotten what we call a care package from home, you know. In this care package, he had tortillas, he had menudo, cans of menudo, beans. I don't know what else he had in there, you know. But man, we partied like we were back home. You know, we had our beer and we had these goodies from back home, and we partied with me for that short time. We were back home.
And that's what led me to Ring of Red. Ring of Red is a testimonial-style stage play that I wrote based on about 24 of the oral histories that I had collected. It tells the stories of 6 Mexican-American characters, 4 men and 2 women, from their childhoods in the barrios of Los Angeles to the wars in Southeast Asia and then to their return home. I wrote the play by taking those oral histories and creating 6 representative characters from them. And a theater veteran named Rose Portillo, she served as the director and the co-producer. And that was really important. I've never acted before or been involved in the theater other than as an audience member. And Rose was not only a partner then, she was also kind of a teacher for me. She helped the play take shape in important ways that I could never have imagined. The actors were other collaborators, but so were community members who came to early readings of the play. We sponsored an audience talkback that helped give us a sense of what worked and what didn't. And those also morphed into these really unique spaces where a bunch of strangers were gathered together, all based on the commonality of their connection to this history. The formal production first ran in September 2018 at the Bootleg Theater in Los Angeles. We had okay audiences for the opening weekend, about 60% capacity, but then we were lucky enough to get covered by NPR and the local CBS affiliate, and so we closed our 2-week run with 4 sold-out shows. Here are some stills from that production. And after the initial run, we did another performance of the entire play at my college campus, and then last year, Center Theater Group in LA sponsored 3 readings of the play at different East LA public libraries. Without a doubt, this has been the most rewarding experience of my professional life. Academic work is rewarding, to be sure, but the audiences we reach are often so small. And the most we hope for is the acknowledgement of our fellow historians that we did well or that we made an important contribution. But rarely do we get to experience others experiencing our work. And even with all the talk about accessibility, rarely do we ever encourage and support versions of our work that are more legible and meaningful to the populations that we research. My journey into this world has been as much about improvisation as it was about planning and intent, but I'm very encouraged by the growing community of other public-facing scholars, like my fellow panelists here, and what our collective work means for the future of our discipline. Thank you.
Hi everyone, this is Romeo Guzman. Excited to be part of this panel. I have 5 minutes, I'm going to jump right into it. Public history practice starts with the South del Monte Arts Posse, so what I'll do is I'll talk about how it is that I formulated what public history is and where that comes from, and then I'll sort of very, very, very briefly nod to some of the projects that I've been involved with here at Fresno State, where I'm currently faculty. So my public history practice starts with the Saltamonte Arts Posse, which is an arts collective based in Saltamonte that's interested in using arts to think about space. And in 2012, El Monte was celebrating its centennial anniversary. It was celebrating its 100th birthday. And as part of that celebration, we were very sort of troubled by El Monte's official narrative, which is the end of the Santa Fe Trail, and which centers and privileges the so-called white pioneers, right? So anything that came before or after is irrelevant and excluded. So we're very troubled with this, and we also wanted to use the opportunity as a way to sort of reimagine the history of this place, and not just reimagine the history of the place, but also imagine how it is that we can build history and how history can exist and work. So what we ended up doing is we ended up working with and collaborating with an archive in Mexico City that was in the process of being formed, and it was La Casa del Hijo Lavizote, an archive dedicated to the Flores Magon brothers. And there was two really important connections. One is that La Casa was thinking, and Diego, I should say, Flores Magon was thinking and preoccupied with how an archive should work, right? And who the archive should function for, and how the archive exists out in the world. So in some ways, the ways in which Diego was thinking about the archive, we were thinking about art and space. And the other really important connection between SMAP and El Monte and La Casa was that the Ricardo Enrique Flores Magón had spent time in the Sacred Valley, particularly in El Monte, so there was this historical connection. So in 2012, we began this project, and I'll sort of tell you exactly what happened, but let me just say that we've been working on it since then, and we sort of arrived to what we consider to be a model for doing public history, which is to build reciprocal relationships between historians and the public, to create multiple homes for primary and secondary sources. And really what we mean by that is transform how people experience history, right? And also to think about the archive as inspiration for changing the physical landscape. And as I mentioned, this is a really long project, so I'll just throw this up to give you a sense of how robust it is and how many different partners we had throughout it. So part of what we did is we had to build the archive, right? So building reciprocal relationships between communities and historians. So we scanned a lot of photographs, collected a lot of oral histories, and we partnered with local institutions for that. Once we had a sense of some sort of narrative, we would then sort of share the archive with community, and we would also share it with scholars, and we would produce and share the scholarship in ways that was accessible, right? So oftentimes we would sort of say, okay, this is what we have so far. Tell us what we're getting right, what we're getting wrong. And whenever we had an event where we shared what we knew, we always had opportunity for folks to contribute to that history, right? And as I mentioned just now, a big part of this was creating knowledge that was accessible. And another big part of it was also thinking about how people experience history. So this is a mural that we threw up that was inspired by the archive. And since then, one of the really big projects has been to produce this book, which is a collection of 31 essays that radically transform how we understand El Monte and also El Monte's place within the larger LA area in Southern California. And it begins with Tongva and it ends in the 1990s. It's a radical departure from the pioneer narrative. So let me just very quickly say that it's with the SMAP model that I've built a projects and a public history initiative here at Fresno State. And two of the projects that I'll just very, very briefly talk about is a history of hip hop, straight out of Fresno, and other football. Both of these projects focus on popular culture. Both of these projects are intergenerational in the sense that we're trying to talk to and engage multiple generations. And both of these projects are also multi-ethnic in the sense that we're trying to engage different ethnic groups across the city. So I'll just sort of show you, and then I'll sort of stop. So for Straight Outta Fresno, all our events were structured on a B-Boy battle, and this has to do with how we experience history. This has to do with really thinking about centering community as part of this historical process. And for the other football, one of the ways in which we disseminated knowledge was through these trading cards that we would sort of constantly give back. This was one of our events which I can talk about, and I'm at 4:53, so I'll stop right now.
Hi, I want to welcome everyone to the OAH virtual panel, Communities of Color in Public History. And this is a panel that we convened very much as a roundtable of discussion and kind of processing thoughts and ideas designed for people of all levels in all experiences in the public history realm. and public humanities, I guess it's fair to say, beyond just historians. So we want to speak to all levels, and especially to people who are just experimenting, as many of us have, for the first time or for the second, early on in their careers with this. I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. So I'm the chair and moderator. I'm James Levy. I am associate professor of history at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and I'm the director of the public history program there. Julie.
I'm Julie Wise, associate professor of history at the University of Oregon, and today I'm speaking about the Nuestro South project.
Tomas.
Tomas Sommer Sandoval. I'm an associate professor of Latinx studies and history at Pomona College, and my project is Ring of Red, a Barrio Story.
Romeo Guzman. I'm an assistant professor at Fresno State, where I direct the Valley Public History Initiative, but I'll soon be migrating to Claremont Graduate University as an assistant professor there.
Awesome. So I'm going to just throw some questions out, and I think I guess I'll direct, these questions are for all of us, and so we'll just sort of have an open discussion, but maybe to get things started, I will direct first question to Romeo. But let me I want to more broadly say that when we think about communities of color in public history, as we've been talking back and forth as a panel, I think we realize we're talking a lot about power. We're talking about a relationship between scholars and universities on the one hand and communities on the other, and that interplay. And when we're looking specifically at communities of color, all questions about power, inequities, sort of cultural privilege play into this. And so I think when we frame what we're talking about, which is something that all public humanities scholars have to engage with anyway, we want to think about these questions of who has power when it comes to authority. People use the word shared authority a lot. How does authority play out? And it's not always in one direction, but how do public historians deal with that? Expertise, even how we define expertise, what knowledge is. There are traditional ways we understand it in the university, but I think a lot of our work tries to challenge those traditional ideas of what expertise even is. And of course, the stories that are told, who has dominance, which stories are more dominant than others, why, how did that even happen? So I think with that frame in mind, Romeo, if I can throw the first question out at you, and Tomas and Julia, please, jump in. But I guess I want to get to that basic question of expertise. I think this is something that, a lot of people think of as something that's almost an objective idea, almost a neutral idea, and of course we all know that it isn't. And so in your project, speaking from your own experience and your project experience, how do your community partners, how does your university define expertise? And maybe even talk about the differences between those three, the people, your colleagues on the one hand, you yourself, and your community partners.
Yeah, I think perhaps I'll start with myself and my students by extension, and also the community partners. I think in some cases it's really explicit in the sense that community members know that they have knowledge, they know that they have some sort of expertise. So for example, for the Straight Up Fresno project with B-Boys, they're very aware that they are the B-Boys, that they have this history of dancing, that they embody the history, like they are aware of the ways in which different moves have come in a different time period. So they know very much that they're experts in this, right? I think with other folks sometimes, when you're doing an oral history about a barrio or something like that, like they may not consider themselves experts. And some of our labor is to remind them that they are experts, right? But regardless of how community members define themselves, or how they think of themselves as experts or not, we always approach them as experts. And we always try to emphasize not just that they're expert, but we try to think about what that means for the larger project. So aside from just doing interviews, aside from just collecting stuff from them, we try to integrate them in ways that really shape the project itself. So as you saw in some of the slides, we really try to think about the format that the project takes on as being reflective of things that they already care about, right? So for us, an academic setting might not fit well with the stories we're trying to capture. So then for us, that really, we take that to heart, right? Like, what does it mean to do a history of b-boying? What does it mean to do a history of soccer? What does it mean to do a history of El Monte and South El Monte? And how do we give that knowledge back? But also, how do we restructure things to where we're all really experts in that? And I think on an individual level, as faculty, as students, as community partners, it's easy to do that. I think when it gets challenging is when the universities come in, right? How do we sort of replicate what we're doing on an individual level when it comes to things like equity, when it comes to things like resources, right? So if we do have shared authority and we do have shared power, we don't have shared resources, right? We don't have shared salaries and things like that. So then I think at the university level it becomes a little more complicated, but we can, perhaps you can let Tomas and Julie chime in and we can sort of come back and circle around.
I have one follow-up question with you, Romeo, just one, because you in your presentation, you talk about this archive that you guys started. And I think that's a really great example where the archive is this body of knowledge. It's often formalized, even if it's in a historical society. There are best practices, obviously at university, this is true. And yet you're creating this kind of community-based archive, which you're saying, done right, to build an archive, it can literally challenge the way people think of space and their ownership of that space. Can you just say a couple more things about that? Because I love that idea, and I just wanted to see that, how that actually played out in your project more concretely.
Yeah, so maybe I'll reference the Salto del Monte one, right? The Salto del Monte project, the large narrative of the city, of El Monte city, is the pioneer narrative. Wagon trains, white pioneers, they're what matters. It's on the logo. It's in the official history museum. That's kind of the prominent narrative. So that gets embedded not just in the logo, but in the sort of cultural landscape of El Monte, right? Names of parks, names of streets. There's an actual like pioneer park. So for us, one of the things that we discovered, which is I think one of the biggest discoveries, was we found an old 60mm film reel in the basement of Salto del Monte City Hall. And when we saw it, we learned that there was murals that had been whitewashed or lost or erased. And then through that process, we learned more about these murals. So then one of the ways in which we're sort of thinking about that, right, is what does it mean? Who gets to determine what exists on the walls? So one of the reasons that the El Monte murals were whitewashed, because Grant painted an Adelita, a Mexican revolutionary. And the idea, right, was that, white residents didn't want a Mexican woman, let alone that was armed, to be in the Valley Mall. So part of what we're thinking about, right, is in sort of saying, what do we do with these murals that they're lost? How do we bring them back? We're essentially reclaiming not just the history, but we're reclaiming that space. And we're saying that we have an access to that space and we have a right to that space. And we have a historical precedent to sort of acknowledge that. So I think that's kind of some of the ways in which we think about the archive as literally changing the way we think about our own claim to this area, right? Our own claim to this particular place.
That's really powerful. Tomas, I think about your project too, almost on the other end, because somebody, and you describe yourself as someone part of the community, right? Your parents and relatives kind of being involved. Obviously, oral history in some ways is inherently an archive that comes from the community, or at least it should be. So I guess I would ask you the same question kind of in reverse. I mean, are there ways in which this more traditional university-based scholarly idea of expertise and knowledge either helped or hindered your project?
I don't know that it was much of a factor, but I also think that maybe it's the term of it, right? Because I'm not so sure that everybody, but every partner that I had certainly recognized what their expertise was, but their need, what they were getting out of the project, wasn't necessarily about that expertise, right? Like I think the key, like I love the question, right? Because the question already disrupts what is a really troubling history with academic research in communities of color, right? That you should be really predatory, just going in and how you can use them for your academic research. And really public work, the kind we're doing, especially, it's about reciprocity, right? There's this back and forth. And part of that reciprocity, I think, I think the real challenge is making sure that everybody that's at the table knows what it is that they're there for in terms of what they need out of it, what they are getting out of it, what they desire from it, right? What are their interests in it? And that really does fall down to a certain level of expertise, right? Everybody recognizing what it is that they contribute, as well as, starting to think about what you get from it. So I don't think it was much a factor, because that kind of level of expertise, at least in what we give to it, was really clearly defined. Because I think when you do this kind of work, you have to be humble. And I came in really explicit. I don't know how to do anything to put on a play. And bringing in people who were theater experts was how that happened, right? And also, I'm not a veteran, right? All along the way, as an oral historian, you're always in that kind of mode, I think, when you're interviewing a population that is so different from you, yet very familiar and close.
I love the phrase, I don't know. I mean, think about how many people in academia don't say that. We don't say that enough, right? And that is such an opening, sort of welcoming kind of approach. Do you think, I guess another way of asking the question though is, do you think if you weren't affiliated with the university, if you weren't a professor, that would have changed, like you could have done exactly the same thing? Just if you were an interested guy who wanted to learn about theater and somehow you got a grant and...
Probably. To be honest, sure. I mean, probably, I mean, if I were somebody who was more involved in the arts to begin with and had done a lot of oral histories, I probably would have been better at what I was doing than being a university person. But university did bring certain things, right? It brought resources, which are very hard to come by, especially in a very community-centered arts world. And it brought some kind of legitimacy too. Which ended up being far more important than I think anybody anticipated in the plan.
Do you mean legitimacy can help get grants, but you're speaking specifically about legitimacy within the communities that you worked with? Is that part of it too?
A little bit sometimes. I think a big part of oral history has to have some kind of authentic trust in who you are as a researcher coming in, and I mean somebody is sharing a very personal part of who they are, their story, and they have to have some sense that you are somebody who knows what they're doing, that you're going to steward it well after. And being an academic helps that, but by no means is that the solution to it. You can be lots of academics who don't have that, right? But that does help me, I think. But no, I was thinking more we created this space and this process in this space to create this theater production, and my academic connections actually helped to advertise it, really. I mean, there were strange benefits there that would not have come without the university or college affiliation.
Got it. I guess, Julie, I mean, maybe on that thread, your project has some overlaps with Tomas as well in terms of the podcasting and interviewing people, and of course, I guess I'm curious about the same thing with you, both the question of expertise more generally, but also this idea that how did your role as an academic shape or get in the way or help or both your own project?
I appreciate your acknowledgement of the I don't know, because I go, oh God, that's all I say in this project is I don't know. And even among, the four of us, I'm the one that's the newest to this work. I've been doing it about a year and a half. But the expertise on our team is both really clear and also very incomplete. None of us had ever made a podcast before. The only person with technical expertise was our editor, but she had done mostly visual video. Eric, our creative genius, whose idea this all was, he has lots and lots and lots of vision, but had not made a podcast before. So even on the creative side, things like narrative, how to reach this population that we wanted to reach, Latinx youth in the South, how to just make those connections. Like, I was truly clueless and have learned a lot. And I think conversely, I think when they think of me, they think of my expertise as being on the history, basically. And my research starts in the early 20th century in various sites throughout the South, New Orleans, Mississippi, Arkansas, and it does end up in North Carolina, 1990 through around 2011. And so that last chunk is a chunk that the hosts, who are all college students who were born around the turn of the millennium and grew up in North Carolina, they lived through that. They lived through the losing of the driver's license for undocumented immigrants. They know what that was like. And when we made the podcast about that particular history, it had a different feel to it because they had lived it and they were experts on that, at least as much as I was. However, for the earlier historical examples, these students are not connected to people who were in Mississippi in the 20s or, Arkansas in the 50s. And so I think they really look to me to be the expert on that, both in terms of giving them feedback as they workshopped ideas, and then at the end, editing the audio and just making sure there weren't, errors, like factual errors in it. And they really, I think it goes to that idea of the past as a foreign country, and you heard that on the audio where Axel's going, oh my God, can you believe that in the 80s in Georgia, the farmers were actually protecting the workers? That's insane, So it's in many ways, the history of Mexican migration to the South is a history that has mostly, but like really mostly been more welcoming than these students' lifetimes. And so it really is a foreign country to them to think of the South as the place that was a better place, let's say, in terms of racial tolerance for Mexicanos specifically, than let's say California, which today they would assume would be the opposite. So yeah, I think they saw my expertise as being really specifically in the history, and all the creative and connection and message expertise was something I am learning about from them.
Awesome. I mean, you guys, this question for all three of you, or all four of us, I guess, it's just, for people who are kind of getting started and are thinking about working with, communities outside of the university walls, what are the obstacles in being and having that identity? I mean, I can think of a lot of the advantages, and both of you just spoke about that a little bit. The obstacles to being sort of representing the university, or having a PhD next to your name that could actually be a hindrance, and how do you get around that? Anyone? Romeo, you said we were about to. Go ahead, Julie.
Yeah, I know. I just think since I was working with college students, that's their environment. Like it's not new to them that like a white professor wrote a book about history that they're learning about, or that person is serving in some sort of mentorship role to them. Like that's the environment that they signed up for when they went to UNC and Duke. And so I think in that sense, doing a public history project with college students, I think is very different than, when I think about oral history or just other interactions I've had with community as a whole. It's very different than, thinking about doing an interview with an elderly African-American man in Arkansas about his experiences with braceros in the 50s. That's a very different interaction than an interaction with college students who are juniors and seniors and have acclimated, I think, to what it means to be in that kind of elite institution surrounded by mostly white people with PhDs.
But but even in that itself, I think, Romeo, you were talking about people not even being aware of their own expertise. Is that part of our job to try to say, if there are these assumptions being made about us that everybody's comfortable with, oh, you're the expert, you're the historian, you're the person running this, you've got the institutional credit, yes, professor. How many times have people said to me, okay, doctor, this is you, not me, you're the one who knows. Is part of our job to try to challenge that and transform that a little bit so people become aware of how much expertise they really do have and take more ownership, feel more entitled. And if so, how do we do that?
Yeah, I think time is really important, and what I mean by that is like spending time with people is really important, and I think as regardless of whether it's a soccer project or whether it's the football project, which are here in Fresno, I'm not from Fresno, I'm from LA. So when I came here as a faculty member who had done something that no one knows about, right? So whenever we started a new project, our beginning point was always, let's have lunch, let's have a conversation, let's have multiple conversations, and really try to sort of set out the terrain, like why would they care about this, and what ways do they care about this, and really try to create reciprocity before we even start the project itself. So for us, talking is really important. And I'll give you two examples from the old project. I think, not the old project, it's still current, but from the older project, because it kind of took me aback a little bit. There was one institution in El Monte that we're on a great relationship with, so I won't say their name, but at first they were very distrustful, and we couldn't understand that, right? I was someone who was getting a PhD at Columbia, who I thought they'd be proud about that. My wife's a writer, she's from there. My parents are from there, but there was a sort of generational rift, I think. And there was a sort of distrust that was created around that. And I think the more time we spent there, we went to some of their fundraisers. We finally had someone that was part of the institution and that knew us pretty well, also sort of talk a little bit to them. So I think sometimes, regardless of whether or not there's distrust or trust there, a lot of this has to do around conversations and trying to figure out where reciprocity exists. Because I think assuming that having a collection of 10 oral histories in an archive, that might not be reciprocity for them. Like they might not care about that, right? So I think that's really important. And I'll just give you one more example because I think it's a really funny one. And this one I can sort of be more explicit about who it was. You know, we wanted to work with the city of South del Monte, right? And we emailed the mayor. We were very polite. We had a meeting with him, and and we went to his office, and he said, "I've never seen you in my park. I've never seen you in my park. I've never seen you at my events." And we're like, "We didn't know it was your park, dude. Like, like we didn't tell him that, but we were like, what is going on here?" And we didn't want money. We just wanted a space to work in, right? We wanted to use some of the facilities that are already public facilities. And what ended up happening there is we ended up talking to one of our high school teachers that we had worked with pretty closely. And we said, "Hey, we're having a hard time with the city. Like, we talked to the mayor. We don't think he understands. We're not sure why. We're getting some resistance." And she said, "Oh, let's go have beers with this person who's a council member." We went and had beers. And then the next week or two, we had secured like the basement of City Hall to work out of for the project. So in some ways, right, like sometimes it's not just about talking, but it's about talking to the right people who can then sort of do some translation for you, right? So I think that's maybe for like new people doing this. I think, you know, to not be discouraged if, you know, the first knock on the door is not a positive one. It may be that there's translation that's not happening. It may be that they don't understand. It may be that they need to see your face a couple more times before they feel comfortable with you.
Yeah, it makes me think about like what needs to happen, right, to do this work. What needs to come first? And the ways that I think about it for myself and really tell the other people are the relationships. The relationships have to be there first. I mean, that's kind of how I came into public history to begin with. I mean, I've been doing community engagement work on our campus since like, you know, over a decade now. And my very first public history project was building on a relationship that had existed for a couple of years with me in a local community arts center. And it was like taking that relationship after we had already a relationship of trust and mutuality and some level of reciprocity. It was like sitting down together and thinking out loud, you know, what could we do to do this, to make this happen? And I think relationships have to be there. Like, and that's maybe the hardest part of it in terms of work is cultivating a relationship. But that seems very self-interested, but just maintaining a relationship, right? In the middle of everything when you don't have the resources to do this thing that you're dreaming of, right? But you're working towards it still. But like, I wonder, and this is a legitimate question, like, is that the only way? Like, is that a thing that should come first, is relationships? Or are there other ways to do public history where there's another starting point? I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. But I do think that the concept that you guys were talking about, and I think, Romeo, you also put it in concept of time. I mean, time is such an important factor. So, you know, it's like if you're a photographer, you can't say, I'm going to go capture this, you know, the protest now, and boom. If a good photographer is going to sit and wait, and it may be he's there at 8 in the morning or she's there for 10 hours, it may not even happen that day. But if you just are patient, you're there enough, eventually something will happen. And that requires not just time for the thing to happen, but also you kind of have to listen. So you start learning where to look and you start knowing who to follow. And all that is very, very adaptive. And I know, so I think one thing that doesn't work with public history is when you write these grants and there's a hard timeline and you don't have a relationship, then you're kind of forced to force it. You know what I mean? And like, there's a lot of people, you go to these conferences and people talk about shared authority, right? And so you go to your partner and say, well, I want to share authority with you. You know, maybe you're not that awkward about it, but that's kind of what I often hear. Like, this is our, I said it, I think, you know, this is our ethos, but that's not what gets the trust built. It's just to say that you have a good ethos. My one example, and then Julie, I'll let you, I think you want to say something, but in terms of building trust, and we're actually moving into our second question, which is the insider-outsider question about all this. But, you know, in my project, we have all these different communities at the same time that we're forming partnerships with. And so when we talk about insiders and outsiders, there are so many different insider-outsider dynamics going on. And being a university professor, working with communities is only one of those divides. Being a white guy working with, you know, we had some white farmers, but a lot of people we work with were farmers of color, right? That's another insider-outsider thing. And one of the communities that was key to us was the Milwaukee farmers the urban ag people that we were trying to form partnerships with. And I had heard about this amazing project in Milwaukee, this garden project in one of the most hard-hit neighborhoods in the whole city because of poverty, and they happen to be the zip code that has the highest per capita incarceration rate in the entire country. And here's where my students come in, because at public university, our students are insiders in those communities often. And one of my students, actually, by coincidence, he wanted to work, African-American kid, he wanted to be a filmmaker, he's into journalism. He said, I want to do the Milwaukee thing. And by coincidence, he had grown up for the first 6 years of his life 2 blocks away from this garden. And then he went and he called these guys, and they still told him, yeah, we've had too many people who are interested in us, too many people that are studying us. But what he did was he persisted. He went with me to the deeds office. He went to the archives. He learned about the history of the neighborhood before, and when German descended people were there, before African Americans moved in the 60s and 70s. He taught the community organizers about the history of the neighborhood, and they were so impressed by him and so excited to have one of their neighborhood kids grow up, to be this sort of budding, brilliant college student that she said, I've said no the last 10 people who approached me, and now I'm saying yes. But that was about time, right? That was about persistence. That was about listening. But also it was about him being an insider. And I guess I wanted to get to that question, this question of how has it, because on this panel among us, we have both insiders and outsiders, I think. And maybe we're all outsiders in some ways. But even just in terms of the theme of this panel, communities of color, if we talk about lines of race and ethnicity, I know Julie and I would be more as white people, white identified people, right? More outsiders. And I'm just wondering if the three of you could speak to advantages and disadvantages of being, well, maybe starting with, how do you identify? Do you identify, Tomas and Romeo, do you identify as insiders with the communities you work with? Maybe start there.
I mean, I do largely, but not all of them. I think it's a mix of being insider and outsider for me. I think where I am insider as a Chicano, as somebody who grew up in Southern California in the time period that we're talking about, as the son of a Vietnam veteran, right? All those insider things have been really instrumental to my success as an oral historian, and they were important to this too. But in a whole bunch of places, I was an outsider, and that was okay. I mean, I think all of us are insiders in some point, right? Like when you kind of have to, even if you're not, you have to really ethically, you have to be some version of an insider before you do these things. Otherwise, you should be the servant who is helping to do one specific task to another set of community interests. Unless you are some kind of insider, how can you be the one to have certain ideas of what needs to happen or what can happen for a certain end?
I love this idea. Can you speak to that with sort of in relation, say, to me or to Julie or anybody? And Julie, I want to hear what you have to say too, but how does one who is sort of, by identity an outsider, at least, from the outside, become an insider? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's not, I think you both have wonderful opportunities to share with us some of the ways that you define insider, outsider. But I would say insider doesn't have to be of the same racial ethnic background as the community that you're talking about. Like, communities are living, breathing things. Communities by their very nature, in fact, one hopes most can take in not just sameness, but also difference, right? But really, it's like it goes back to your time thing and authenticity and trust and right. But communities can move that way. How one becomes part of the community that they wish to work with and for is not a single answer, right? But it's a thing that can certainly happen, even though there are different kinds of issues of trust that I'm sure you confronted. I can only imagine you have so many moving parts in your project. Like I can imagine there are so many levels of trust that you had to confront in different versions of that community. But it's all something that can be done, I think.
Well, I love that. Go ahead.
I always tell my students that, they're really both, right? Like, there's generational differences. they weren't there. So they're always kind of both. And the most important thing is to think about in what ways they're both. And I think to sort of riff off Tomas, right, it's also important to be aware of how that shifts over time. So when I started the soccer project here, I didn't know the soccer community, but now not now because of COVID, but before this, I'd go to a regular Sunday pickup game where I play soccer with everybody, and they refer to me as el profe. And some of them know what I do, but a lot of them don't. So I'm part of this community because I play soccer with them, and they don't really know what I do. And then I'll invite them to something, and they'll be like, "Oh, I didn't know you did that. Like, that's cool, whatever." So I think it's really nice when perhaps you start as an outsider of some sort, and then you sort of emerge and you're part of the community in sort of these different ways. And I think that should be a goal of ours, right? To sort of not just sort of come and extract knowledge, or not just come and extract resources, but to become part of the community where they can ask things of you that maybe are outside of the project. So I would just sort of say that, like, the evolution of those categories is really one of the benefits of doing public history, one of the joys of doing public history.
I totally agree. I love the concept of being able to ask things of you that are outside the bounds of the project. That's a really great idea and concept. So, but Julie, I'm wondering about you. Do you see yourself as an outsider, or have you become, using Tomas's idea, like an insider over time? How would you sort of speak to these questions?
Well, I thought, I'm definitely not an insider until he said the thing about ask things of me. I guess I don't know that makes me an insider, but certainly the students have asked things of me in terms of mentorship, or can I talk to you about my senior thesis or whatever. I think they were recruited by the nonprofit Latinx Ed that's based at UNC Chapel Hill for being these awesome students that have gotten really involved in the community. And they're people that are from first generation backgrounds and are now juniors and seniors and have learned how to navigate these institutions. And so they've been quite skilled, I think, at adding me to their realm of mentors that they're going to figure out how they're going to get support from that person. I don't know that makes me an insider necessarily. And I think in that sense, not only not being a Latina myself, but also I have not lived in the South. I've only researched there. And I don't live in their community right now. I do think Latino communities in the places where I've lived would consider me somewhat of an insider in the ways that you guys have described, but not there, because I have not lived there. But I think, to me, when I think about our project, I just think it's all very clear. I think they all know who I am, who I'm not, that they're not going to seek mentorship from me on how immigration insecurity is impacting their mental health right now. That's not an area that I will have personal experience with, but that they can seek mentorship from me on a lot of things that I can be helpful to them. So I just think we're all very clear on what it is. I don't know how else to put it. I don't think I think I'm very clear on who I am and who I'm not, and they're clear on who I am and who I'm not, and it just all feels very clear, and therefore it feels like it's been a really very positive working relationship, because everyone knows what everyone brings, and everyone, I don't insert myself really into the conversations that are about the aesthetics of the product, frankly. That's kind of their thing. Partially because I don't really listen. Partly I'm also an outsider to like podcasts. I've listened to like 3 or 4 podcasts that I've listened to more than one episode of. So yeah, the aesthetics of the project, like all of that, we all understand that. I don't know about that. It's possible that someone with my background could become an expert Latino podcaster and know that market, but I don't. So, so yeah, it's just, everyone's very clear in their roles, and I don't, I haven't represented myself as an insider, nor do they need me to be, I don't think.
I like that concept as well. I think that I'm guessing that all of us would agree with this, that there's another thing to say about this insider outsider thing, which is, as Julie put it, just clarity of roles. You don't need to be someone you're not. And the thing that makes people most uncomfortable, and you can broaden this out to social relations and interpersonal relations in general, is when you don't know where someone's coming from and who they are and where they stand. I think that clarity can be very powerful, and it can be very can provide people sense of sort of balance, security, and trust. So sometimes I think public historians, I think I've been there in younger years, trying to be something we're not, or trying to be places where we don't need to. Just know who you are and know who's who. Okay, so
can I add something in? Because I think maybe one of the biggest parts then of being an insider is just caring, right? Is that people see that you legitimately care because one thing we are all doing that is exactly the same is it's about story, right? It's about narrative. It's about helping to craft and collect, and then project back a narrative that is recognizable to people, and that helps them understand that they're part of a larger community of which they may not even have been physically aware, right? And a longer historical continuity and all that sort of stuff. And they have to know that we care, right? And if you care about that narrative, that does overcome a lot of the difficulties.
I was just going to say the same thing, actually. Like, I think even using the word care, like, I think they know that my commitment to the Latinx community goes beyond the book that got me tenure. Like, I think they know that, even if because of my location, that expresses it more in different places. And that doesn't change anything about my personal identity either. And we all know that. So, yeah.
Those are really great thoughts too. And I'm have to say this end with, because I think we're actually over our time.